And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It's my privilege today to have Darren Myers from the Freedom Encounter, Freedom Focus, today to talk about an exciting new project that I'm looking forward to learning more about and actually seeing kind of come to fruition. So, Darren, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, thanks.
So, Darren, I want to have you kind of jump in and share a little bit about your ministry. Before I did, though, I wanted to kind of set it up with a quote that I imagine most people know, and that's by George Santayana, who said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." But that quote assumes that the past was terrible, right? That you missed the lesson of something terrible. But what I was kind of pondering this morning was, well, what if the past was actually remarkable and it was something that you wanted to follow, but those that can't remember the past are condemned to not repeat it in that sense? And Os Guinness talks about how the United States has become a cut flower civilization where we stand up for human rights, equal dignity, but the principles that undergird those things has been cut, and we're kind of living in the after effects of it. Certainly concerning. And so, Darren, that's been a focus of yours in trying to help people renew their belief in American freedom, to kind of study our history, not in a way to think that we're so much maybe God's chosen people or something, but that we focused on God's principles. We were blessed, and we want to continue that into the future. So, Darren, if you would share a little bit about yourself and also your ministry. We'll dive into some of the specifics of the museum in a second, but a little bit about you.
Sure. Well, I actually was an education major, music education in college, went on to be a youth pastor for about 15 years in music. And then I pastored for about 13 years. And then we've been on the road for the last 6 doing this ministry called Freedom Focus. So while I was pastoring, of course, I've always had a heart for our country and have always loved freedom and the freedom of religion in particular. But got a hold of William Federer's book, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations. And just once again, that's such a great resource because there's so many quotes all in one spot. And, the more you read that, the more inspired you get. And it's just a reminder of the rich heritage that we do have as Americans that is rooted in the Bible and Bible principles. And so anyway, we started, I had a theme one year at our church called America, We Still Believe. And basically what made America great in the first place is what will keep us great. So we went back and highlighted a different founder every week and gave their quotes and kind of taught our people who they were. And it was just a tremendous encouraging theme, really, because so many of them, there's so many quotes about the Bible and faith and moral living and prayer and Jesus Christ. And so that kind of led us to do a rally downtown. I'd seen some God and country rallies that didn't say a whole lot about God. So I thought, our town here in Rolla could really use one of these, and let's just give it a try and see if we could really reconnect people with our founding and those founding principles. So we set up a big screen and had a Patriot Day rally outside, fed everybody, invited all the local law enforcement and the military branches, and they all came and set up their booths. And we actually that first year had William Federer speak, and then we had a military band perform at the band shell, and then had our kids come out and give quotes, and we put quotes in videos and quotes on posters and set up a little museum out in the parking lot full of quotes. And so that was our whole emphasis, just kind of pointing people back to the Creator and back to the principles of faith. And we ended up doing that for 7 years, and it was just a tremendous outreach to our community, and it was kind of our gift to the community. We weren't asking for anything from it. We just wanted to educate. And our big year, we had 5,000 people down at the park. It was just tremendous. And then from that, David Gibbs had been one of our speakers, and he challenged me to try to think about how we could help other churches do something like this. So that led to a ministry called Freedom Focus. And then, so we have been traveling for several years now, helping churches do rallies like that, but also just freedom conferences and speaking in schools and camps. And
So
then we live close to Branson, Missouri, because that's kind of where my family is right now, and had a connection with the theater here in town, and they let us lease it 1 year to do a theater version of the same content, and not really sure if it would work or not. And we scheduled it for 5 days during Veterans Week, and that little theater would seat 110 people if you set out chairs. And we didn't know if afternoons, evenings would work. We didn't know if anyone would come because there's 100 other shows in town. And the Lord filled that little theater up with 110 people all 5 days.
wow.
And it was just interesting to me that the Lord did that, but also just that there was enough of an interest when nobody really knew us, and yet they're hungry for this message. So we did it again the next year and the next year. So now we've done it 4 times. Last year we did have about 1,000 people, and of course that was during COVID and all of that, but had a great time. And then that kind of led us. It's kind of like we've been on this journey, and the Lord's kind of gradually uh, led us along here. But our next idea or burden vision is to create a space, a museum walkthrough experience that tells the story. And that's what we're working on now. We're calling it Freedom Encounter. And I guess I can say more about that later, but that's kind of an overview.
But this is remarkable. And so the big idea is having, in a sense, a freedom encounter, kind of like the Ark Encounter. And you've seen some of these museums go up, like the Museum of the Bible, the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. And so this would be kind of a Christian look at the founding and what are some of the principles that inspired the foundation of the United States, and how can we learn more about them and replicate them now. Just for a few reference points, so you are in Missouri, and then you mentioned David Gibbs. You would be David Gibbs of the Christian Law Association. And for listeners, one of the reasons I started the podcast was wanted to look at practical things that we can do. Part of that is kind of mapping this space for somebody that doesn't do that all of the time, or think about this all the time. Kind of who are the different players? Christian Law Associations, great legal ministry that's been around for a number of years. I deeply respect Dr. Gibbs. So a couple of questions that I think, especially for church leaders, as they hear the term God and country, as we look back on the kind of 2020 election, and we see just how divisive the United States is becoming. I think for a lot of pastors, they're, well, what does that mean? And so many things these days is, well, what do you mean by that? And so I did want to just lay a bit of a foundation, and I enjoyed having a conversation with you. And maybe 2 weeks ago, so gracious and just letting me kind of work through some of those questions. And so American history, especially the American founding, is disputed these days, to say the least. Sources ranging from David Barton to the 1619 Project. And so if somebody be interested in maybe even bringing a church group to the museum, I'm sure, especially a pastor, would say, okay, well, what's kind of your basic view of these things? And so just kind of lay that out there. What is your basic kind of general view of the American founding? And I think the specific question is, was America founded as a Christian nation? You hear all this talk about Christian nationalism these days. So I know that's kind of a broad question, but I'll kind of let you take the time you need to answer that one.
Hmm. Right. I have never been comfortable going so far as to say that God founded America. I've got friends that say that, and I've read some books that say that. Um, so maybe that could be argued, but I would just say it like this: God-fearing people prayed about founding America, and God gave them special insight and wisdom to be able to do it. So these were not perfect people, obviously, but it's really the only Gentile nation that we know of that was founded from the ground up instead of the top down. So it was a grassroots effort. The people really were throwing off tyranny, and they wanted to have the consent of the people, of those who govern over them. So they were following Bible principles to install a government that would honor God. There's a great quote from Margaret Thatcher. She said, if you accept freedom, you've got to have principles about the responsibility. And you can't do this without a biblical foundation. She said, your founding fathers came over with that. They came over with the doctrines of the New Testament as well as the Old. They looked after one another, not only as a matter of necessity, but as a matter of duty to their God. And then she said, there is no other country in the world which started that way. So I think, as you reflect on history, we've got thousands of years of governments and this whole struggle of God-given government, how to set it up correctly and how to do it right, if there is such a thing as right. And the people that came to America certainly weren't perfect, and we can all see their flaws. Just like if we looked around today, we'd see everybody's flaws as well. Mm-hmm. But they did pray a lot, and they were seeking to set up a government that honored the individual and the freedom of choice and the freedom of religion and limited government. So those principles are biblical ideas, and in that sense, it is a Christian nation. So there's ways to put that where we're not a theocracy or anything, but it was certainly built on Bible principles to honor the individual and his choice.
One of the ways that I've heard it described recently, which just resonated with me, was the United States is a nation built on humble faith and common sense, kind of practical wisdom. And when I look in Scripture, of course, the Old Testament, you have the theocracy, which would be the ultimate. If you have a wise king who's the ruler of the universe, and we look towards Christ's eternal kingdom. But you then switch to a monarchy, and actually in the actual text, the people of Israel are warned about the problems with monarchy. Exactly. But then you also see anarchy in the book of Judges. So it appears to me that as human beings, we are free to, if we're given the opportunity, to set up a form of government, and that the United States founders set out to do just that, kind of weighing biblical principles with all of the lessons of history. And when I talk to Christians, I'm like, okay, well, what if you were given a chance to form a government? Would it not have checks and balances? Would you not want to be given some say in these things? And so I think it is a remarkable founding. And so, what exactly do you mean by, are we a Christian nation? If it's deeply influenced by Judeo-Christian principles, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one other thing that may come up is, what do you mean by freedom, right? And so I've been having this conversation a lot recently. So let me see what you think about this. I think freedom originally, and I think the freedom you're talking about, is a freedom to build a society according to God's good design. Whereas freedom now, for some people at least, means a freedom from God's good design to kind of build a society according to our own design, our own desires, which is a lot more like Judges in a sense. So when you say the word freedom, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's great. So for the last 6 years, we've been preaching on this concept of freedom, and I probably use Psalm 2 more than any other passage, just because it lays out, that the kings, these Gentile nations, are raging, and what they do is vain. In other words, it's unproductive, and yet they are determined to do it. And basically, Psalm 2 says that they are against Jehovah and his anointed one, Jesus Christ. And of course, that's 1,000 years before Jesus was born, but he's clearly in that passage. And in fact, later on in the passage, it talks about the only begotten Son of God. So it's interesting that these guys were spiritual, they were religious, they received worship themselves as pharaohs and kings and Caesars, but they were highly offended when it came down to Jehovah the Creator or Jesus Christ. And so this passage was written 3,000 years ago. And it's fascinating because that's exactly the same battle we're facing right now. Mm. And they say, I think it's in verse 3 or 4, that why we're against the Creator and Jesus specifically is because we do not want his moral boundaries. They said we need to throw off the cords that hold us back, and we don't need to be held back by his laws. So basically what they're saying is, if you really want to be free, you've got to get rid of God. You've got to obliterate this idea that God defines family and God defines gender and God defines right and wrong, lying, stealing, private property. If we could just throw off God, then we can do what we want and truly be free. But the reality is, later in Proverbs, he says, it's your own sins that are your cords. And so your problem is not God's moral law, or as our founder said, the laws of nature and nature's God. That's really not going to solve any problems if you ignore those. The chains you need to worry about are the chains of your own sin and your own addiction and your own selfishness and your own unforgiveness and bitterness. And those are the chains. And so the Bible defines freedom where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty, there's freedom. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. It's within the boundaries of God's moral law or the laws of nature and nature's God that you find freedom. And it's not only the freedom to do what is good and right and healthy and productive, but it's freedom from the chains of sin and the pitfalls of selfishness and, lust and murder and stealing and all of that. It's freedom from that. And you can only find that within the moral boundaries that God gave us. So polar opposite definitions of freedom.
That's so good. And I really believe that is at the very core of the division in our country today. I mean, you have different cultures, you have different political parties, but I think for Christians, we should focus on that division. And Psalm 2, I was just reading it again while you're mentioning it. So good. The kings of the earth set themselves, the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder, cast away their cords from us. It sounds like our culture.
Exactly.
And verse 4, he that says, and the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. So he's still the king. So thank you for, I think that's so true. Yep. So thank you for jumping into that. Next question, and I get probably a softball for you, but why is studying or experiencing history so important now? So you're asking people, hopefully church groups, families, to take some time, come to Branson, take time out of their schedule to go back and study this part of American history. So kind of your elevator pitch for why this is important now.
Well, obviously, if we don't know the lessons of history, we are destined to repeat them, the mistakes and the tragedies. And if we were to start over right now, if all the good people in the country or God-fearing people moved to an island and we started a brand new nation, we would still need laws. That's what civil means, is that we have agreed to some common rules and behavior. And then we're going to have enforcement of that, because not everyone's going to willingly go along with it indefinitely. So that's what government is. And history is just studying what has already happened. So if we were going to start this new government on a brand new nation, and if you don't start the government, you're going to have anarchy. Everyone will just do whatever they want ultimately. But if you're going to be civilized, which is what civics is, the study of this relationship with man under common law, then we're going to have to, I would hope we would do three things. First of all, I hope we would pray and say, God, give us wisdom. I hope we would look around and see what works and what hasn't worked throughout history, number two. And then number three, I would hope we would look to the Bible and say, are there any principles that we can use to help set this up in a way that would honor God and be fruitful? And, that's exactly what our founders did, all three of those things. They looked to the Word of God. They quoted the Bible more than any other single book. That saturated their worldview, Bible principles about all of this. They looked at history. They were well aware of every kind of government that had preceded them. And Benjamin Franklin mentioned that. The Madison and others mentioned that we've studied all this stuff. We know what works and doesn't work. And then thirdly, they did pray. Benjamin Franklin called for prayer during the Constitutional Convention and said, one reason we're having so much trouble here is we didn't take time to pray. And if we don't pray, we'll be no better than the builders of Babel. And So they took time, called in a local preacher and said, "Hey, pray for us." And it totally changed the course of that constitutional convention. And they ended up giving us the Constitution a few weeks later. So, they've already done what we would have to do if we started over right now. And if you don't have any anchor in history, you're not going to know what they did or what they came out of or the horrors of tyranny and why America is so special and has been so unique. So, if you disconnect from history, you're just floating like driftwood out in the ocean. You really have no sense of where you came from or where you're going, and you're liable to do anything.
So I'm thinking specifically of a number of pastors, especially younger pastors that I speak to, that over the last maybe 30 to 40 years have heard the founders quoted a number of times in public life and are just a little reticent about, well, this God and country type of thing. I, I've been thinking recently about the push, especially in public schools, other institutions, to kind of rethink American history. And I'm receiving a number of calls about how a lot of that curriculum will include unbiblical principles. In the look back at American history, now, certainly, I often say that our history is imperfect but impressive. And there's some very, very dark chapters. The one that I will often mention is kind of a sum up of that is what happened at the Battle of Wounded Knee, where essentially we're taking the Sioux from their land. There was kind of a struggle, and then we used the equivalent of machine guns that mow down men, women, children. The survivors were taken to an Episcopalian mission. And just a couple days after Christmas, there's a banner, "Peace on Earth, Goodwill towards Men," which was kind of just for me, kind of the imprint of national hypocrisy at the moment. So we recognize those, but if you just focus on the evil, just the bad, you miss the rest of the story. And so kind of this balanced view. And so those that would oppose biblical principles are making a hard push right now to say, here's the story of America. And I think it's incumbent upon us as Christians, Bible believing Christians, to say, no, here's the story. Yes, we recognize their foibles, just like you said. Here's the issue. So one of the questions that does come up in this space is kind of the distinction between church and state. And that's certainly going to be something that would be dealt with in a museum like this. And I appreciated your answer when we were talking through this. So again, kind of your view of what church and state look like.
Wow. Okay. So, you know, the best of men are men at best. And, we're just not perfect. It's like a family. God tells us, raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, honor and submit to your husband. And he gives us the basics, but doesn't spell out what time to get the kids up and how many hours to educate them and the details of how to have, whatever, family reunions. There's just so many practical things that you've got to pray about and find. It's like seeking for that wisdom. And so, the same thing is true with the local church. He gives us the basics, the leadership and the purpose, but then there's so many details that are not filled in, and we've got to figure out about baby showers and nurseries, and so many practical things. Government's the same way. God gave us the basics, and He said, "Look, I'm instituting government after the flood." And by the way, before the flood, it didn't turn out very good without government. You want to know what anarchy looks like, read Genesis 6. But God said, no, from now on, we're going to have capital punishment. And if someone kills someone, mankind's going to go after him and try him and then take his life if he's guilty. And that's the institution of government by God for our good. So Romans 13 says it's really for your good. We're not to fear government. We're to understand that God is doing this so that we can live a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty, which is all any of us really want. But He gave us the family, He gave us the church, and He gave us government. So we're looking at all of this and saying, what are the Bible principles and how do we, what's the 30,000-foot view? If someone has to be in charge of enforcing law, how do we do that? You got sinful men in charge of sinful men. So the guys that are in charge of enforcing the law could be bribed or could be corrupt. And so the whole struggle here for thousands of years has been, how do we do this in a just way? And that's exactly what Madison and those guys were trying to address when, that's the struggle back then. So the whole thing of church and state, is just that there must be a way that all three of these can work in perfect harmony because God gave them to us: the home, the church, and the state. So, as God's people, we ought to be just as interested in the state and what's going on as we are in church or family. If we abdicate that space, who's going to fill it? The ungodly. So, do we really want to live under their rules and guidance and wisdom? You know, it just makes sense that God's people would not only pray, as Paul told Timothy to do, for kings and all that are in authority, but that we would be heavily involved. And if Romans 13 says that these are ministers of God, I believe that means God calls them to be attorneys or to be, governors or legislators, just like he would call a pastor or a missionary or anyone else. It all works together for our good unless we leave that space, then we can't expect it to turn out good.
Well, Darren, I appreciate you taking the time to lay a foundation for us today. I know that those were questions that I have, just because there's so many, different disinformation, differing opinions, just kind of all out there. I appreciate you kind of laying the foundation. I believe that you have a biblical, nuanced view about the United States, and that this is looking back to the past. Here's a group of men that tried to follow God in their time, and we can do the same now. We shouldn't forget the story. So, with that said, why don't you jump in and kind of lay out kind of the 9 different sections of what kind of a trip through the museum will look like? And I'm thinking about, if bring the family up there, what is a family or church group going to experience?
Right. Well, and so of course we haven't built this yet. So I've had several
Nice, I
people
understand.
ask, when's it open? And right now we have a property that's been purchased on our behalf, and we're in the middle of a capital campaign to secure the property and convert it into the kids play area and this walkthrough museum as well as the theater. So just lay that out front there. But basically, the walkthrough would have 9 sections, as you said, and it's just an overview. And if we were going to boil it down to 3 words, it would be this: tyranny, faith, freedom. And what exactly does that mean? Well, this has been going on again for thousands of years. You can track it all the way back to Nimrod. And there's some really powerful quotes about Nimrod by Josephus and others who, from a historical perspective, explain him as a tyrant and his defiance of God. And in fact, he wanted to get revenge on God. So for destroying his forefathers in the flood. So it was, if you start, so what we're going to do is start with the individual and just say, first of all, God made each of us unique. And we'll have this section using technology and music and lighting and special effects to really create this world of wonder where we think about how amazing every individual is. Because Calvin Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge said that all liberty is individual liberty. I mean, it really boils down to the individual being able to live out their life as God created them to do it. So that's the first room. The next room is the tragedy of tyranny. And so we'll have kind of a walk through. Of course, this will be darker and lots of quotes, but the music and the effects you'll walk past Nimrod and his Tower of Babel and Pharaoh and the pyramids, and then Nebuchadnezzar and the image, and up to the Caesars, Attila the Hun. It'll just kind of be an overview of tyranny and what that's looked like for thousands of years, leading all the way up to the Pilgrims. And then we'll have a special place there also highlighting the Fox's Book of Martyrs and other martyrs that were slaughtered by these kings, and some of their faith statements, their dying words. But it's just an opportunity, sometimes I'm sure of it, we have lived so separated from tyranny that we can't appreciate freedom. We just assume it's always been this way, and what's the big deal? But the people who are most passionate about our story and our ministry are the foreigners that come up. I mean, if they're from the Ukraine or wherever, China, they're like, you are exactly right. Boy, this is true. And they have a passion about it that most Americans don't have.
So I'm sure, and I'm going to stir up something here. I'm sure at the end of the Tyranny exhibit, there's going to be kind of a mannequin of an American Christian having to wear a mask while going to church. That's going to be Tyranny. Now, I'm going to get some emails on that one. If you've listened, I think that's a Romans 14 issue of conscience. But no, I mean, kind of in comparison, I just wanted to throw that in there to make sure everybody's still listening out there. But
Yeah.
no, I like that overview. And so what's the next section?
Well, the next thing would be the desire for freedom, and we'll just point out how that man, all the way back to Israel leaving Egypt, uh, has had this desire to live free. And what does that even look like? How does that work? How do you limit government and yet still have 911 to call for emergencies and all of that? So the Magna Carta, the Reformation. The nation of Israel in the Old Testament, these are all seeds of freedom that led up to the Pilgrims finally just launching out and saying, we're starting over. So we've got some creative ideas about how to present that information. But then the next room is the Pilgrims. And again, just using their quotes, I really believe that by the time you get to the Pilgrims leaving Europe, your thought would be, no wonder they left. The Tower of London, the persecution, the execution of so many Protestants. And it was just a bloody time, the Dark Ages. And so when you kind of put it all in perspective, why were they leaving? I think a lot of folks are going to say, I had no idea. This makes a lot of sense, and then you use their quotes about how they wanted to establish a city on a hill, an example for other nations. The freedom that they were pursuing. Uh, that'll be an interesting section there with just highlighting the Pilgrims. And we may even have, all through this, there'll be some interactive kind of stuff. So I won't say too much about how we're going to do that, but it should be interesting. The next thing is the founding documents, where actually we'll have a colonial chapel where you can kind of hear excerpts of some of the sermons that they preached during that era, during the Great Awakening and during the Revolutionary era, and just kind of get a feel for how that was in the church, in the colonial church. And there's so many great quotes that are just inspiring. And so that chapel will really be a good opportunity to display those. And then the founding documents, we're going to make the Constitution, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights large and break it down to where it's real simple. And you can just, at a glance, kind of see what it says and the principles, just the basic. We'll make that as simple as we can, because a lot of folks have never even read these documents, but we'll make it fun and big. And there won't be any way you can get past it without understanding what the basic ideas were. And these were revolutionary ideas, just that we're going to recognize the supreme being. We're going to recognize a creator above all earthly kings. That's the Declaration. And then the principles that came out of that. And then the Constitution is, how do you limit government? How do you set up a government where there will never be a tyrant again? And then the Bill of Rights, how do you protect every individual from this potential ever-growing government? And those are just powerful thoughts. And people need to stop and think about that for a minute in light of the tyranny that they just walked through. So then, the founding documents, and then the next section is the blessings of freedom, which is mentioned. That phrase is in the Declaration, and so we just talk about the prosperity, the inventions, the patents, the number of immigrants that came from all over this globe to come here, that promise of hope and freedom, and the prosperity, really the economic prosperity and the charitable giving by these guys. I mean, we've given more than any other nation for years and years, and it's because of capitalism. It's because of the blessings of freedom, and just kind of chart some of that, document it for the folks. Putting a man on the moon, even. I mean, just celebrating what happened as a result of those founding documents. And then the next section is the cost of freedom, and that's a tribute to the military and everybody that's had to pay the ultimate price for freedom. And there's so many good quotes about that. And we'll have video testimonies of different veterans and what freedom means to them. Um, that should be a very emotional and powerful, somber section. And then the last one, or no, then there's also the modern enemies of freedom. And then we'll touch on some quotes from Karl Marx and others who um, really also from the spiritual perspective have shown what side they're actually on. And they're how they despise God, they despise the Bible, they despise these principles that come from the Bible, and ultimately they're against freedom. So that's going to summarize the modern enemies of freedom. We probably won't go into a lot of detail about specific movements because those come and go, but those principles are very real, and the spiritual war is very real. And I think people will make the connections, just by seeing uh, the quotes from Hitler and Mussolini and all the rest of them. And uh, that'll be an emotional, powerful section too.
Yeah.
And then the last one is the future of freedom. What are you going to do about it?
Well, I'm just thinking about the current enemies of freedom, kind of almost having a mirror, like just to look at it ourselves, to the point that we are talking about earlier about it's the differing views of freedom, and we can all fall into that category of kind of raising our fist to the King of Heaven, and we can ourselves be enemies to that. So, well, it
Yeah.
sounds like a really powerful lineup. Family and I had opportunity to go to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis here recently. A great place if you're in the area for kids. They have an entire floor dedicated to 3 or 4 historic individuals, and so I think this is really important, and we shouldn't get away from it. So I'm grateful that you've kind of jumped onto this task and God's led you into it. As we kind of finish up today, a couple questions. First, just any kind of meaningful moments where you sensed God's leading, kind of God's blessing on this project. You've already described, having a theater there in Branson. That seems pretty remarkable to me. But anything along those lines?
Yeah, sure. Well, we've been on this journey for at least since about 2008. And that's when we started having those rallies there in town, and the Lord just really blessed those things. And honestly, to my amazement, that many people would come out for this message, because it was clearly celebrating one nation under God. And we lived in a university town with a lot of foreign students, and I just thought, man, I'm going to get some pushback. This is going to be rough, but we're going to take our stand. I never had any pushback, and it was just amazing how many folks. And God may have just been protecting us, but still, it was the Lord just kind of was leading us down this path. And I could go on and on with other things, but getting this building here in Branson is sitting on 10 acres. It's 60,000 square feet. It's just a beautiful facility at an amazing price that could only be the Lord working in our behalf. Um, then I've been praying for the right people, and the Lord has really led us to some amazing people that can help us do this, that have built museums before. In fact, Billy Ong is our project manager, and he worked for the Herschend family for 25 years or so, and was involved in their planning and development of all their new projects, including new attractions at Silver Dollar, Dollywood, the Stone Mountain Park, and several things that the Herschend family had owned.
Mm.
And then he also then developed the traveling museum for the Green family, Hobby Lobby group that
Okay.
was the forerunner to the Museum of the Bible in DC. And so he's got a lot of connections and just an amazing guy. We really
Well,
appreciate him, and he's involved and will be the project manager. And I could go on with those kinds of things, but in fact, the first time I called Brother Gibbs about this, I said, I've got this crazy idea and I really need you to talk me out of it. And he said, all right, what is it? I said, I want to build an experiential museum telling the story of tyranny, faith, and freedom. And kind of gave him the overview. He said, I got one question for you. How many of these would you like to build? He said, we need one in the South, in the East, the West. We need them all
oh,
over.
wow.
And I'm like, no, you're supposed to talk me out of it. But anyway, it's just almost like the Lord has just given us green lights all along this road. And I'm excited to see what the Lord's going to do.
Well, I love the spirit of kind of kingdom entrepreneurship and seeing those doors open. I was just looking at the team you've assembled. It is remarkable. So similar to the Ark Encounter, I think this is an important question as well. When somebody finishes up there, what's the ultimate purpose of the museum? And similar to the Ark Encounter, do you have a presentation of the gospel kind of wired into
Mhm.
the
Yes,
experience?
definitely. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the ultimate goal is to understand and appreciate freedom. And that's why, I mean, we are flag waving, we love America, but it's really not some kind of a nationalistic thing. Um, Honestly, it's about the bigger concept of freedom and the purpose of government to protect our God-given rights to pursue God. We're only here for 70 years. And God didn't create us to bow down to the state for 70 years. That's not our purpose. In fact, government didn't even come along till, a long time later after the flood. And God created individuals and families, and he wants us to seek him and feel after him and find him. That's the purpose of our 70 years. Governments are only instituted to help us do that, to protect us while we're doing that. And if you don't understand the purpose of government in the first place, you're going to get way off track, yeah, really quick. So that's all we're trying to do is help people understand what is freedom, and it's freedom to pursue God. And then that also includes personal freedom, which is freedom from the chains of sin. And that only comes through Jesus Christ. And we'll use a lot of quotes and testimonies of those that have gone before us to help drive that point home. But that's what it's all about.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing this come together and having kind of a place for Christians to go. Our first step when we're trying to help Christians become gospel centered citizens is to rethink that role. What does that look like? What does scripture say? What are some of the lessons from history? And so, what better way to do that than through an actual live experience where you can have the kids I know you're going to have a lot of things for them as
Mhm.
well,
Right.
and we'll link to the website and also to a video that you've put out about the possibility of it. So before I ask you the last question, I know that you're in the middle kind of a capital campaign, and so if those that are listening are inclined to kind of jump on board and they see what's going on here, they're interested in it. How can they join forces with you, learn more about the project?
Sure. Well, I would just, anyone that asks, what can I do? I say there's two things. Number one, you can pray. And that really is the most important thing right now. The second thing you can do is go to the website, freedomencounter.com, and fill out the Enlist Today form. There's a pledge form also if you're interested in giving a one time gift, or we're really emphasizing a 3-year pledge right now. So we're in the middle of our Forwarding Freedom capital campaign. And if you could give $10 a month or 20 a month or 50 a month or 100 a month, that is going to help us be able to get this thing launched. There's a lot of expenses. And the only way we can do this is if God's people respond in faith and say, I want to be a part of this. And I think about Israel, and the 12 stones and the memorials that they built. And there needs to be a memorial in this country saying, here's the spiritual struggle that led to America. And there's so many quotes to back this up. It's just really inspiring. but there is no place that I'm aware of where you could take your family and see that side of it. But that is critical to understanding this whole thing. So if you believe in that, go to the website freedomencounter.com and sign up and join the team.
And I was just impressed with, this is not you coming up with this idea yesterday and putting it together. I mean, you've had planning studies, looking at the interest. Branson's a great place to do this. So um,
Mhm.
I'm just excited to see where this goes from here.
Yes, sir.
So if you had a billboard to display a message to church leaders, other committed Christians, what would you put on it?
Well, I would just say that the cause has always been about the truth. That's what this all boils down to. Freedom is a product of truth.
Mm,
Jesus said, "You shall know the truth will make you free."
mm,
So the goal really isn't freedom. The goal is truth. And if we can, there's power in truth. So if we can more effectively get truth to the average person, we can have a shot at preserving freedom. But if Satan is successful at deceiving the nations and lying to this, the millennials and Generation Z and whoever's next, then there's no way to sustain freedom. So our goal really is, let's point people back to the Creator, point them back to truth, and let truth do its work to make us free.
wow, that's profound. Thank you for sharing that. That's back to again the dynamic between the two freedoms. It's really what's true, what's not. So such an encouragement. Well, Darren, thanks so much for taking some time to be with us today. Any final thoughts?
Uh, just every time you're watching the news and you're discouraged and hopeless, pray for us. We're trying to do something to poke holes in the darkness, and everybody's got to do what's in front of them. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your podcast. I appreciate anyone that's sharing truth, because that's our only hope. And local churches all across this country, being bold and preaching the truth and uh, taking a stand. I mean, that's our only hope. So,
Uh,
if you get discouraged and you think all is hopeless, pray for us at least. And God, no telling what God could do with one little spot here in the middle of America.
yeah. Well, you hit on the distinctive of the podcast, at least the one that I attempt to pursue, and that is we have lots of information out there, but the question, what do we do next? What do we do now? And so I appreciate that you're out there trusting God to help put this together. Excited about the project. So thanks for taking some time to be on.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.